Welcome back to our study over the life of Joseph, from dreamer to dungeon to dynasty. We are just continuing through, and today we have made it to Genesis chapter 43. Most of you know, if not all of you know, that I went to school at Harding University for undergrad and graduate work, but specifically at the undergraduate level, there was 1 week that would take place every fall semester. You would go home for Thanksgiving, then you would come back to campus for 3 weeks. And this 1 week that I'm referring to was wedged right in the middle between Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it was called Dead Week. During Dead Week, really nothing happened. Chapel didn't meet. The extracurricular activities, they did not take place. Classes did not even meet. The purpose for Dead Week was to study for your exams, which would take place the following week, so that after you took your exams, you could go back to your dorm room, pack, and go home for Christmas vacation. Now, that's what the week was supposed to be used for, was for a week of study or finishing up other projects. Do most students use Dead Week for that purpose? Probably not. But Dead Week was not a fun week because it was just lifeless. All you did was study or prepare for big test. When we look at the life of Joseph in Genesis 37 through 50, Genesis chapter 43 is kind of like Dead Week, or at least it looks that way from the surface. Now that you know that, I'm sure you're excited for this lesson. But if you look at Genesis 43 and walk away from it saying, not much happens here, I think you've missed the point of the chapter. Because in all reality, there's a lot that takes place in Genesis chapter 43. After all, Genesis 42 is the big homecoming between Joseph and his brothers after 22 years. And as we read that story, even though we know how the story ends, it feels like we just kind of sit on the edge of our seat, just waiting to see what's going to happen. Genesis chapter 44, which we will look at in the next study, is the story of going back home to get Benjamin, and there's the famous silver cup incident. But one might say that Genesis chapter 43 is just a chapter that doesn't serve much purpose. But again, that would be a wrong assessment of this chapter. The brothers return. There's the big banquet. Joseph meets Benjamin. But what I want to do in this chapter is focus less on Joseph and focus a little bit more on Jacob, the patriarch of the family. And here's where I want to begin as we focus on this chapter. Grief affects our faith more than we realize. Grief is going to affect your belief in God more than you often think that it will. And we really see this in the life of Jacob, the patriarch of the family. Even though it's been 22 years since Joseph mysteriously disappeared, and even though Jacob thinks that Joseph was killed, Jacob still isn't over it. And his grief is almost more than he can bear. Now, if we go back to chapter 42, when the brothers return from Egypt, after getting the grain, they come back without Simeon, and they tell Jacob that we're going to have to take Benjamin back with us to Egypt to get Simeon out of the Egyptian custody. Jacob says to his sons, Genesis chapter 42, verse 36, "You have deprived me of my children. Joseph is no more, and Simeon is no more, and now you want to take Benjamin. Everything is against me." Everything is against me. Have you ever heard someone say that before? Everything is against me. When do people make that statement? Well, obviously they don't say that when things are going well. They make that statement when they are in the fierce battle of grief, right in the middle of the storm. And when we get to chapter 43, Jacob knows they're going to die if they don't get more food. And Jacob knows that he's going to have to send Benjamin to Egypt to get that food. But he just won't let go of Benjamin, because in his mind, he's already lost 2 sons. Joseph years ago. Now Simeon, he's there in Egypt and he's not getting out. How can I lose a 3rd child? And he tells his sons, Genesis chapter 43, verse 6, "Why did you bring all of this trouble on me by telling that man," talking about Joseph without realizing it, "by telling that man that you had another brother?" He looks at his own sons and he says, all of this is your fault. All of the grief that I feel, it all should be placed on your shoulders. Jacob is not in a good place. He is angry. He is depressed. He feels defeated. Even though almost 2.5 decades have passed, the wounds feel like they were inflicted just yesterday. And that is often the grip of grief. Let me ask you, why is it that it seems like grief stays around for such a long time? Why is it that grief doesn't just go away? Well, you've probably heard that clinical psychologists and licensed counselors have historically defined 5 stages of grief, and those 5 stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and finally acceptance. Denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and then that last one is acceptance. And psychologists and counselors will say, if you don't travel through each season or stage of grief, you're not going to completely heal. Now, people may skip the order in which they go through each stage. You may bargain before you go into denial, or you may be depressed before you get angry. But if you don't travel through each phase, you're not going to recover well. I think we can correctly assume that Jacob, the father, hasn't traveled through each phase of grief, and he hasn't healed. He is angry. He is bitter. He makes the statement, everything is against me. And then he tells his own children, this is all your fault. And now you've told this man in Egypt that you have another brother, and I'm going to lose Benjamin as well. And that's when this story takes an interesting turn, and we see that those who minister to us in our grief are not always the ones that we expect to do so. I can only imagine that Jacob would have never thought that one of his own sons was going to be the one to help him cope with his grief as a father, but that's exactly what happens. And do you remember which son that it was? It was Judah. Jacob's 4th son, delivered by his not-so-favorite wife Leah, steps up to the plate to help his father Jacob see the hope of tomorrow. And Judah tells his father Jacob some pretty powerful things. Once Jacob makes it clear that he won't release Benjamin to Egypt, Judah says in verses 8 through 9, send the boy Benjamin along with me, and we will go at once, so that we and you and our children may live and not die. I myself will guarantee his safety. You can hold me personally responsible for him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him here before you, I will bear the blame for the rest of my life. Now, what Judah is offering in that statement is not just the blame emotionally, but he's telling his father Jacob, you can remove me from the will. I'm banking my inheritance on this. I promise, Dad, if you let me take Benjamin, I will go to Egypt, I will get Simeon, I will get the food, and we will all come back home together. It's going to be okay. And if it's not, you don't owe me anything. Reuben makes a similar offer last chapter, chapter 42, but it's not as sincere as Judah's offer. Reuben tells his father Jacob that he can put Reuben's 2 sons to death if Reuben doesn't follow through on his promise. But what type of grandfather is going to kill his grandchildren? Not likely. Judah, on the other hand, Judah lays it all out on the table. And Judah says, Dad, I will come back. I guarantee it. And then he gives his father Jacob the reality in verse 10. He says, if we had not delayed, we could have gone and returned twice. Judah tells his father Jacob, stop dragging your feet. The clock is ticking. If you want us to survive, we have to go. We have to get more food. And if you want to see Simeon again, I got to take Benjamin with me. True leadership rises to the occasion. And Judah is a true leader who is ministering to his father Jacob. And it's at that moment that something very interesting happens. We see a very important response from the heart and from the mind of Jacob, the patriarch of the family. First, he says in verse 11, take some gifts with you. If this is going to happen, take extra food, take extra money for the journey, which is a big deal because remember, they're in a famine. And if Jacob says to take more assets with you, Jacob is making himself and others who remain back there in Canaan sacrifice even more. But what's even more impressive than that is Jacob's words in verse 14. Jacob says, may God Almighty grant you mercy before the man so that he will let your other brother and Benjamin come back with you. As for me, if I am bereaved, then I am bereaved. What's so interesting about that statement is that Jacob uses the term God Almighty. In the Hebrew there, it is the name for God El Shaddai. You know, the Hebrews had many different names for God. The most 2 common names we find in the Bible, or at least in the Old Testament, are Jehovah God, which is the relational nature of God, and then Elohim, which refers to the strength of God, the power of God. El Shaddai speaks to the faithfulness and to the loyalty of God. And Jacob hasn't used those words El Shaddai in the text for several chapters. And it appears as if Judah is helping to heal his father's heart, which has been so bitter and so broken, where Jacob once again can refer to his God as El Shaddai, the loyal and faithful God. It looks like the trust in God that had wavered in Jacob's life was beginning to return. And it was all because of his 4th son, Judah, who stepped up to the plate to minister to his father Jacob in Jacob's tremendous grief. If we fast forward to the New Testament, maybe that's why Paul would tell the young preacher Timothy, don't let anyone look down on you because you're young, but set an example for the believers in speech, in life, in love, in faith, and in purity. True leadership is not defined by the age. True leadership is defined by the heart. And Judah has the tremendous heart to be an incredible leader. And so, as we always do, here are just a few takeaways from this chapter. Number 1, a faith weakened by the power of grief should not scare us. I mean, think about it. Jacob is a patriarch of Israel. He's in the heroes of faith in Hebrews chapter 11. But even this great hero of faith struggles with what he believes, and he struggles with what has happened in his life. Admitting doubt is not weakness. In fact, admitting doubt can be a sign of strength. God knows that the difficult moments in life will cause us to lose fervor, and God is not intimidated by our questions. What should scare us is when we suppress our doubt and our frustration so long that it leads us to walk away from God. But if you are going through difficult times in your life and you ask difficult questions about the nature of God, you are not a weak Christian. You are a human being who is walking through a very difficult season of your life. I asked our singles here at Prestoncrest this last Sunday, when you go through periods of grief or struggle, what are some of the best ways for you to stay close to God? And I loved many of their answers. Obviously, reading scripture was an answer, spending time in prayer was an answer. But one young lady said, choosing the right kind of people to be around. What a great answer. You know, human beings, we were created to desire community. But the wrong influences can harm us more than spending time by ourselves. When we are struggling with grief and a weak faith, we need to be around people of strong faith. We need to be around people who can be a good influence, not those who would encourage us to move even further away from God. And Judah was that very influence for his father, Jacob. Another takeaway is that ministry and ministers come in various forms. The minister is not always the one standing behind the pulpit or teaching the class. It can be someone who visits someone in the hospital room, or it can be a deacon who leads his ministry, or it can even be a young child who writes an encouraging note, or someone in the church foyer who smiles at you, hugs you, says it's good to see you today. Think about in your life, when have you seen ministers or ministry in some pretty unique places? I can think of several things I've seen in 13 years of ministry. I keep all of those precious pictures that children draw me from when I've been preaching. Maybe it's about the sermon or even a picture I've received on occasions. Children draw me what they think I look like while I'm preaching, and I look at those pictures and I say, my goodness, I hope I don't look that bad. But when children tell me thank you, or when members write me encouraging notes, that's ministry in its purest form. I remember several years ago, I was sitting at home, had a knock on the door. It was a young Mormon missionary team, 2 young men. They wanted to know if I wanted to study about their faith. I invited them into the house. They did not convince me to become a Mormon. I didn't convince them to become a Christian, though I tried. But they left that day, and I realized that they had ministered to me in an incredible way, because they had reminded me, if those 2 young men who are 19 years old can be so bold in their Mormon faith to leave their family for 2 years to try to convert others to what they believe, why can I not be more bold in my faith? That was ministry from a very unique place. I've done many funerals in my ministry, and some of the deepest, most sacred moments of ministry are when, after the funeral's over and they're about to close that casket for the final time and go out to the cemetery to put the casket in the ground, that grieving spouse will bend down one more time and kiss their loved one who is deceased on the forehead and say, I love you, and I'll see you again. That moment means more than any sermon that could ever be preached or Bible class that could be taught. That is real ministry. And ministry comes in various forms. And that leads me to my final takeaway for this lesson. Don't ever underestimate how you can minister in and minister to someone else's life. You have no idea what a simple note or letter in the mail or card or hug or smile can do in someone's life. You have no idea who you will see this Sunday at church who has had a terrible week, and your simple smile or hug may be the very thing that A, keeps them coming back to church, or could even be the very thing that keeps them alive. You have no idea what people are dealing with on a daily basis. And you have no idea the depth of impact that you can have in someone else's life. You don't have to have a Bible degree or years of experience to be used by God. You just have to have a faith and a heart that is willing and ready to be used. Just think about where Jacob would have been without his fourth son, Judah, and just think about where your friends would be, where the church would be, if it wasn't for you. Well, again, I want to thank you for joining us today for this Bible study over Genesis chapter 43 as we are making our way through the life of Joseph. I hope that you will come back as we continue this next week by looking at Genesis chapter 44. As always, have a great week. Take good care. And I look forward to studying the Bible with you next time.